If you are a regular listener to the Sociology Show, then you could help with the costs of promoting and hosting the podcast. If you can spare even a small amount, then you can donate on the GoFundMe.com website by searching for The Sociology Show. There is no obligation, of course, and all future downloads will continue to be free. A huge thank you to all those that have already donated. Your kind gesture will help to continue keep the show going and growing. Best wishes and keep enjoying the show.
Hi, you're listening to The Sociology Show, a podcast about absolutely anything to do with the wonderful world of sociology. Whether you're a teacher, a lecturer, a student, or just taking a passing interest, this podcast will look at a range of issues from social class, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, religion, crime, education, and anything else that sociology has to offer. My name is Matthew Wilkin, and in each episode I will speak to someone working in the field of sociology and let them explain all about their own interests, their research, and their experiences. So, put your earphones in, turn the volume up, and let's be sociology geeks together, eh? Hello and welcome to the Sociology Show podcast. My guest for this episode was Dr. Sian Lewis from Roehampton University. And Sian's research looks into sexual harassment on the London Underground, a really interesting piece of research which covers many different areas, looking at feminism and masculinity, space, how males often dominate space, use space and use their physicality to control areas. I found this a really interesting and fascinating piece of research, and I think you will too. And so without further ado, let's go over to the interview. Hi, thank you very much for taking the time to talk to the podcast. Would you like to start by introducing yourself, please?
Sure. So I'm Dr. Sian Lewis, and I'm an associate criminologist and sociologist at Roehampton University for the last year. And prior to that, I'm, I guess, one year postdoc. So I did my PhD at Loughborough University and focused on sexual harassment on public transport, looking at the London Underground specifically.
Excellent. We're going to talk a lot more about that. Where did sociology start for you though, Sian, before university and PhD?
So I suppose, I guess officially education-wise, I was quite late to sociology. So I didn't really have any real knowledge of sociology until my master's. So I lived in Istanbul for a year after university, just teaching English. And it was there that kind of how my experience of the city and the daily social interactions in a place that was so different to home. I really started getting interested in the back and forth between how people interact within a certain space and day-to-day life in the city. And particularly, obviously we'll come on to that, but particularly my experiences are like gendered experiences of sexual harassment. So there was so much that I loved about the city, but it was that day-to-day negotiation of being a woman in public space, particularly on my commute. And so then because of that, I decided that I would study sociology for my master's. So I went to Amsterdam to do gender and sexuality. So we had a lot of kind of core sociological theory, but also we had a module called Gender, Sex in the City. So that was where I really got to kind of put theory to my own experiences.
Yeah. And what type of theory were you reading about there? Was there a particular theory or sociologist that inspired you?
Yeah, so I suppose there was the kind of basic city, looking at the city in everyday life. So there was Le Corbusier, Kevin Lynch's The Image of the City, particularly Doreen Massey, who looks at space, place and gender, and Jane Jacobs, so the Death and Life of Great American Cities. They were all kind of like the underlying urban space element to the course, but then there was also specific feminist writing, not necessarily academic. So Virginia Woolf speaks a lot about being a woman and like the enjoyment that you can get from being a woman in urban space. And Janet Wolfe, so she talks about being a flaneuse, so the flaneur as a kind of sociological, cultural concept of a man who can wander aimlessly through urban space and enjoy the spectacle of the city without being watched. And Janet Wolfe talks about the invisible flaneur and how that just wasn't, it was a very male figure. It's not possible for a female to exist in that way in urban space. So there's always this kind of, you can enjoy the city, but there's the anxiety of being watched. And I just, as soon as I started reading all of those things, I was like, this makes so much sense to me.
That's interesting, actually, because someone asked me once, what's the biggest aspect of male privilege that I think I recognised myself, and that was what I said, actually, because I'm a big traveller myself. I think I've been to almost sort of 90 countries, and very, very rarely do I actually think, unless it's a particularly dangerous country, very rarely do I actually think about just going out and walking around, even with earphones in. Yeah. It's a real aspect that perhaps, a lot of men just take for granted, certainly.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's one of those things that it's until you kind of apply these concepts to it, you know of your own experiences, but you don't quite get to the root of why that is until you start really analysing, okay, why is it that I don't feel safe going out in my own neighbourhood at 11 o'clock at night for a walk? Like, that should be something that's okay. And yeah, like you say, when I talk to kind of male friends about this, and with students as well, one of the kind of key things is when they say, well, no, there's no difference between a man and a woman in the city. And you say, okay, well, as a man, what do you do to protect yourself from sexual harassment on a day-to-day basis, or on the way home from a night out? And they often come up blank. There's nothing. Whereas you ask a group of women, what do you do? And there's things like, well, I pretend to be on the phone, or I don't wear earphones, or I get an Uber instead of getting the bus, or I make sure that I travel with a friend. So there's all these kind of micro behaviours that they sound like not so much of a big deal, but they actually constitute the whole experience of being, in the city as a woman.
Yeah, exactly. I think the fact that if you don't have to think about it, that is a privilege in itself, right?
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Right. And so let's move on to your own research then, Sian. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, sure. So like I said at the beginning, my research has focused specifically on sexual harassment on public transport, and even more specifically on the London Underground. So this kind of came from the reading and the literature that I was just talking about. But I kind of realised that there was almost a gap in understanding of sexual harassment in this specific space. So, as we know, with the Me Too movement and everything that's been going on, sexual harassment has become kind of everyday language. Like, we all understand what that means now. And I think this movement has shown how widespread it is. It's shown that it happens in Hollywood, it happens in the film industry, it happens in the workplace, it happens at festivals, it happens on the streets. But public transport is part private and part public. And so it kind of often gets lumped together with either private space or public space. And I kind of started thinking, well, actually, the way I experienced it, and when I talk to friends, the way that it actually happens is really, really different. And a lot of that is because of the very space-specific behaviours that you get in public transport. So if you have ever been to London or live in London, or anywhere, I suppose, there are these, again, micro behaviours that collectively, there's this kind of microcosm of accepted behaviours on the London Underground. And I kind of got really interested in seeing, how does this actually facilitate and cover how sexual harassment actually happens within this specific space. So if you think of public space on the streets, it's very often catcalling or stalking, because it's almost a fleeting interaction. Whereas in the London Underground, or even on a bus, you're static whilst on the move. You're stationary whilst being on the move, and that's a really unique social and spatial dynamic.
So perhaps we could start with then what you just mentioned, some of the things, what would constitute as harassment? Because I think we can all think of the most extreme, but, down to the more minor categories of what would be classed as harassment.
So for my research, I purposefully, when I was looking for participants, in my call for participants, I didn't give a definition of sexual harassment. I just wanted people to come forward who in their minds had experienced sexual harassment. And I actually got quite a few people coming forward saying, I don't know if what I experienced is sexual harassment, but this guy groped me between the legs on the tube. And that's kind of the more extreme end of it. So that's sexual assault. That's, physical sexual assault, but people aren't even aware. They don't even know if it constitutes sexual harassment. So the spectrum was huge. So it can be, if you look at how the British Transport Police, who are the kind of governing body of policing on the underground, how they define it is anything that makes you feel uncomfortable. So they've also left it, relatively broad. And they say, if you feel uncomfortable, report it, and we will decide, we'll deal with the criminality and kind of legality of those behaviours. But anything between leering, so looking at someone for a prolonged period of time, comments, catcalling, stalking, and then it kind of goes to the more physical forms of groping. The thing that's really common on public transport is frottering. So that's, a man generally rubbing up against a woman for sexual pleasure. And then there was also things like voyeurism and masturbating. That was kind of in the more, I'll go on to that. But all of these behaviours happened in very different spaces at very different times. So some of these things happened in the busy rush hour times, and then some, masturbating and flashing would happen on the off-peak times.
It's really difficult, isn't it? Because if you think, say, rush hour tube, you are packed in like sardines, and so the opportunist could take that to their advantage, right? Exactly,
yeah. And I think that's one of the really interesting things, is that actually, like you say, opportunist. But interestingly, what I found out from, so I did interviews with women who had experienced sexual harassment, so looked at it from their perspective and how they dealt with it at the time, how it impacted them afterwards. But I also interviewed the British Transport Police, and they said, there's this common perception that it is opportunist, that, you're on a busy carriage and you're kind of close to someone. Yes, there is the spatial dynamic that makes it possible, but actually people travel purposefully to commit these crimes, right, because they are crimes. So they arrested people, and we can go on to talk about how it's policed, but the experts in the field of policing sexual harassment on public transport said that they've arrested people who have specifically taken days off work to travel into London to ride around on busy tubes so they can commit these kind of acts of violence. So it's very rare. They said that you get someone who just does it once, like, oh, I'm on a busy tube, interesting, maybe I'm going to grope someone. That's not really how it happens. It's actually, people purposefully doing it and exploiting the space of the tube.
Premeditated.
Exactly.
Interesting. And does your research show that this is a predominantly male to female thing, or do you look at male to male, female to male?
Yeah, so in my research, I just looked at female experiences of sexual harassment, because I wanted to look at it as kind of framing it in kind of everyday life. So what I found from, again, just talking more broadly and talking to the police as well, is it does happen to men, but most often it's committed by other men. So male on male harassment. And also when men experienced it, so the men that I spoke to kind of on a more casual basis rather than interviews for the research, it was a one-off. They remembered it so starkly because it was so shocking that they had experienced sexual harassment. So one police officer was telling me, I was sexually harassed when I was 20 and it still really sticks with me at the age of 60. Whereas the women I spoke to, this was just another experience on top of kind of a whole almost portfolio of, well, these are my experiences of getting sexually harassed in various places. So it was that kind of normalization that I really wanted to get to grips with. But it definitely happens to everyone, but it would be not doing it justice, I think, to say that it wasn't a gendered experience.
Yeah, particularly if it's so frequent for many females. And is at the lower end, because I think we can all agree on the unacceptable, at the lower end, is there any kind of like grey areas? I just think, if someone catches your eye or they smile at you or they hold a look a little bit too long, I mean, there must be some areas where it's really difficult to define, right?
Yeah, exactly. And this is why I found, and Irving Goffman was really useful in terms of framing this. So if you think about accepted behaviour on the London Underground, staring at someone just doesn't happen. If someone stares at you for more than, if you catch someone's eye, you glance away because, or friendly smile, maybe not in London, but, maybe a friendly smile, and then you look away. A prolonged, something, like you say, something so small and so almost intangible is really uncomfortable when it's in a certain scenario. So maybe in a bar, and if you were on a night out, if you caught someone's gaze, you might hold that gaze, and that would be kind of, some kind of acceptable interaction. But on the tube, holding someone's gaze can be really, really intimidating. But just like you said, it's almost a grey area, because how do you report, well, actually, this guy was staring at me and I felt really uncomfortable? And people generally don't, purely for that reason. And of course, in terms of criminality, that wouldn't be a crime. But the interesting thing is that the police, so one of the things that the police do that's really, really interesting is it is these micro behaviours that for them, so they have, the British Transport Police have a proactive team. So this is not based on a report. They go out into the underground every morning, every evening. They have a team of proactive police officers that go out and they look for behaviour that is out of place with the behaviour of the underground. So if someone's just standing that little bit too far forward, or if they don't get on the quietest carriage, they get on the busiest carriage. So all of these really tiny behaviours that is actually an official form of kind of detective work almost. So they're in plain clothes and they have, I think it was something like a 99% success rate. If they think, okay, this person looks like they might do something, they are generally right, because they're experts at picking up on these, kind of really tiny behaviours.
And I guess something like the mobile phone is really difficult as well, isn't it? Because someone can appear to look like they're messaging or playing on their phone, but they could be filming, taking pictures. You can't tell, right?
Exactly. And I think with COVID-19, it's going to be really interesting to see if this changes, because of course it's already changed so much how we relate to each other in terms of space. And of course people haven't been traveling as much, and now people are going to be wearing masks. I think it's going to throw a lot of these kind of normalized behaviors up in the air a little bit. So it'll be really interesting to see if it changes anything for good or for worse, I suppose.
Thank you. And so how do you collect your data? Do you interview the people that have been affected, or questionnaires? How do you gain your research?
Yeah, so this was for my PhD research. I did 29 kind of long semi-structured interviews with women who had experienced what they defined as sexual harassment. So very often the interviews would kind of start with them saying, I don't really know if I'm going to remember much. It was 10 years ago, it was a year ago. But actually the interviews often went on for kind of an hour to 2 hours, because what we realised was we often, like big traumas, so, violent sexual assault and rape is often spoken about. It's either not spoken about at all, or it's kind of, there's kind of support there. Whereas for something like sexual harassment, it's often, like I said, just brushed under the rug. It's just another experience. So actually getting the chance to kind of pick apart these experiences ended up in really detailed conversation. So long semi-structured interviews, and with the British Transport Police, it was the same. It was semi-structured interviews. And to kind of complement that, I also did kind of ethnographic participant observations of the space of the London Underground. So very often if a participant told me, okay, well, this is where this is the route where I was followed, or this is the place where this man pushed me up against the wall in the tunnel, I would go back to those places and kind of look at the social spatial element of where it happened.
Wow, so proper ethnographic research.
Yeah. Exactly.
Great. Thank you, Sian. That's going to be the end of part one. In part two, I'd like to ask you some more about your findings from that research. Hi, welcome back to part two of the Sociology Show. I'm talking to Dr. Sian Lewis. Sian, you just mentioned how you collected your data. What was the most kind of common experience, if you like, that many females did experience on the London Underground?
Yeah, so I suppose I broke down my findings into kind of 4 key chapters. So the first was when them talking about London and their experiences of living in the city and using the tube more broadly. So I didn't want to just focus on this one negative experience that had happened. I wanted to kind of get their narrative and their story and their experiences of being in the city, because I think very often work on sexual harassment can reduce women to kind of passive victims, I suppose. And actually, I know for me and for a lot of the women I spoke to, like, the city is an exciting, freeing place. And it's these experiences that kind of, they ruin it a bit, but they don't dominate it generally. So that was kind of my first area. And then I looked at, okay, what was your actual kind of the 10 minutes or whatever of this experience? So what did the actual incident itself look like? And then I asked them about how they remembered it. So how did it impact their kind of future travelling? What was the impact of the incident of sexual harassment? And then I looked at how the police and the women kind of talk about sexual harassment and understand sexual harassment in a different way. So how their knowledge base was constructed in a very different way. So to start with, yeah, women definitely spoke about sexual harassment as interrupting, and Fiona Vera-Gray talks about sexual harassment as male intrusions. She kind of frames it. She says, we have to put men at the front of this, because it is men who are committing this behaviour generally. And she also uses the word intrusion because that's how women generally talk about it. Like, it intrudes on your headspace, it intrudes on your physical space. It is an intrusive experience. And this is, my research kind of supported that, in the sense of women were kind of going to work, going to meet friends, zoning out on the tube. Anyone who's travelled on the tube, I think, you put your headphones in, you read your book, you're kind of passing time. And these experiences, so very often frottering was the most common. So someone rubbing up against them and groping them, that really, really intruded on their space. And it made them feel like the tube, a place that was, kind of like home to them in a way, like feeling really comfortable in London and feeling some kind of ownership of that space, was really taken away from them. But importantly, very few women actually said, well, I didn't use the tube afterwards. They kind of said, no, actually, this is my space. It was more micro behaviours and adjustments to their behaviour, rather than just stopping using the tube altogether. So it was kind of that they didn't want to be seen as victims of something. They wanted to claim back that space and claim back the ownership. And there was a really interesting interview I had with a woman who experienced sexual harassment twice from the same guy at the same station. And the first time she was silent, he groped her and she didn't say anything. The second time she said, no, you are not doing this to me again. This is my city. This is my tube. This is my commute, and you're not going to ruin it for me. I'm not going to live in fear of you. And he obviously denied anything happening. But people around her pushed him, at the next stop said, mate, you need to get off the tube.
Good. That's glad to hear that did actually happen. This is perhaps a strange question, but is there a particular type of female that is more likely to be targeted? Is it age dependent or race dependent or height or?
I think from my research, I only spoke to 29 women. I would have to say so I put my call for participants on social media. So the women I interviewed were all between 18 and I think 45 was maybe the oldest. So that is already in and of itself kind of, I think this definitely happens to younger people as well. And a lot of the women that I did speak to were talking about historical incidents where it happened when they were in school uniform. So this is, incredibly predatory behaviour. So there was, they were wearing school uniform. There's no umming and ahhing about whether they were old enough. You're never old enough to experience sexual harassment, but they were school children. But I think in terms of race, class, there's an important thing to understand is that in terms of mobility and access to public transport and being able to negotiate and avoid, even though it should never be a woman's responsibility to avoid these things, perhaps what are classed as the most dangerous or risky times to travel, so very late at night or very early in the morning. These could often be people who are working in jobs such as cleaning in office buildings overnight. These are kind of the most, and people who can't afford to get a taxi instead of getting the bus, or instead of getting a late night tube, people who can't actually change their behaviours to, if they wanted to, protect themselves. So there's definitely kind of an intersectional element to all this. But the women I spoke to, you know, some were British, some had lived in London for a year, some had been visiting. I think, yeah, sexual harassment doesn't discriminate, unfortunately.
Yeah, the reason I asked that is because where you mentioned previously in part one that it tends to be premeditated, I wonder if the attacker was quite particular about what they were doing in terms of who they were targeting.
Yeah, I mean, maybe certain attackers have you know, their own motives, whether that, you know, is younger, vulnerable girls. There was one guy that the police told me about who was specifically focusing on women who, in his opinion, were gay. And then there was another man who only focused on women who wore Ugg boots. That was his fetish.
Wow.
So there are very bizarre and scary things going on. But so maybe the particular perpetrator has his own agenda, but generally speaking, I would say not.
And what does your research find as the kind of the reasoning behind this? Is this all about control of power, control of space, assertion of masculinity?
Yeah, so I think it's situated within, I think, Liz Kelly talks about the kind of the spectrum of sexual violence and how it's all on a continuum. So you can't separate what we talk about as low-level sexual harassment and rape. She says, you know, it's all on this same continuum of, you know, it's a way to control women, and a way to kind of, this violence is basically putting women in their place in some way or another. And I think it's important to recognise that this might not be the kind of conscious, active agenda for a perpetrator, but that is essentially what it does. It's seen as that right to someone else's body, and that right to intrude. And I think especially with things like catcalling, whether it's on the underground or whether it's on the streets, it is just seen as, well, I can comment on a woman's body. A woman is there as an, you know, is objectifying behaviour, and it kind of stems from that idea of women being men's property, of being objects there for male pleasure, and it doesn't matter the impact that it has on the woman because she is seen as an object. So I think it all plays into that. And the fact that it is happening in the underground is, you know, it's not like, oh, the underground is a really dangerous place to go. It's just that the space and the social interactions facilitate it to happen in a particular way.
Yeah, that's interesting what you said about that, because if you're walking, you're catcalled. Not that you should have to put up with it, but you carry on walking. Whereas if you are sat opposite someone, stationary, that's a very different scenario.
Exactly. And one of the things that quite a few women said was that they were almost, afterwards, they were ashamed of their reaction to what happened to them. So, for example, there was one woman who, she was on a late night tube after a night out, and a guy sat down next to her and just held her hand. Like, he took her hand and held it on his lap. And she said that she was so shocked that she just didn't know what to do, and he didn't look at her. So then she was kind of like, is this even happening? What's going on here? And she just sat and let him, this was what she said, let him hold her hand for about 15 minutes until it was her stop and she got off and left. And afterwards she was like, you know, I'm an angry feminist. Why on earth did I not snatch my hand away and shout at this guy? But what a lot of the women said was it was fear of escalation. So it was, you know, what if this guy's crazy, or what if he, you know, really kicks off that I've kind of made a scene. And then there was also coupled with a bit of doubt about, well, is this actually happening? This behaviour is so out of place. Surely someone's not actually rubbing their erection up against me. This is probably just me imagining it must be someone's elbow, or it must be a shopping bag. So it's that kind of second guessing and doubting, and then the moment almost passes, and, you know, then you haven't said anything. And you know, something similar happened to me. I was on a bus and a man was touching himself across from me, and I kind of saw out of the corner of my eye, and then thought, no, he's definitely doing that. But then I thought, do I actually want to deal with this right now? Do I really want a confrontation? I'm on my way to meet a friend, and if I say something to him, what's going to happen? And if I report it, then I get kind of caught up in, having to see the police. And I just thought, you know what, I don't want to, and I don't have time to. And I think that's a really important thing, is that there's often a lot of pressure on women to report things that happen to them for the safety of other people, or it's kind of supposed to be cathartic. But I think actually, if something happens to you, there shouldn't be any guilt about how you handle it. And when you do put expectations on women of what to do with their experience, it removes the autonomy that women have again, and it's essentially almost re-victimizing them and making them feel guilty for what happened and then what they've done with that experience.
Yeah, I can totally imagine there's an element of delayed shock, or not understanding actually what's going on until you've thought it through and dissected it in your own mind.
Yeah, exactly. And it's minimizing it as well. I think it's like, oh, well, actually, all he did was touch himself. He didn't actually touch me. Yeah. So I'm just going to push it aside because, I wasn't actually harmed. But it makes you angry, and it makes you upset, and it's invasive.
So I think you mentioned this at the start. What can people do about it? What's the right procedure, or what can be done to tackle the issue?
Well, I think there's no straightforward answer. But I think one of the kind of key things is that the British Transport Police have got expert sexual offences teams. So if you do want to report it, then there is a text number. It's quite easy to actually report, and you will be listened to and you will be heard. So I think that is a real positive, that if you do want to report something, then it will probably be dealt with in a very empathetic and professional way. But I also think that bystander apathy is really important. So this idea of, especially, again, if you think of the kind of social element of the London Underground, people are there, there's not really a sense of community. So I think not putting the onus on the victim to actually have to take control of that situation. If you see something happening and you feel safe to intervene, then I think that that is a really, really important. And I think especially for men, because often women don't feel safe intervening. So if you can, if your friends are laughing about something like this, or talking about sexual harassment, like, stop them. Don't laugh along. It's these men standing up and saying, I'm not okay with this, or can you not make jokes like that, it's not actually funny. These are all things that will make people realise that it's not acceptable, it's not banter, it's not lad culture. And I think it's all of those kind of things that eventually, hopefully, teamed with kind of policy and policing that combats this will hopefully reduce it.
Thank you. That's really interesting. Very interesting piece of research, quite unique, quite niche.
Yes.
Thank you. Can I ask you, Sian, to just let their listeners know where they can find out more about your research? I know you're also on Twitter as well. Yeah.
So my Twitter handle, I think, is Sian Lewis 89. And that's probably the best way. And then also, you can get in touch on there if you want to talk about it in any more detail or find out anything else.
Great. And are you carrying on the research, or are you doing something else new?
Yeah, that's the hope. I think it's a really important kind of, and especially with COVID-19, I think it'll be really interesting to kind of keep an eye on how that changes things. And I also think looking at this across, more broadly than the London Underground, and how it happens in rural areas as well as in urban space. So definitely something I'd like to and plan to expand on in the future.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for your time today, Sian. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
If you are a regular listener to The Sociology Show, then you could help with the costs of promoting and hosting the podcast. If you can spare even a small amount, then you can donate on the GoFundMe.com website by searching for The Sociology Show. There is no obligation, of course, and all future downloads will continue to be free. A huge thank you to all those that have already donated. Your kind gesture will help to keep the show going and growing. Best wishes, and keep enjoying the show.
Thank you for taking the time to listen to the podcast. If you would like to contact the show or be interviewed, then please email thesociologyshowpodcast@gmail.com.